Okay, so this is to continue our discussion about this very impactful moment in the late 15th century, the consequences of European cultures and First Peoples cultures coming together. An exchange of food, an exchange of animals, foods that did not exist in Europe that did exist in South America, in Central America. For instance, New World foods, blueberries, chocolate, cashews, corn, cranberries, hickory nuts, onions, papayas, peanuts, pecans, potatoes. I'm going to return to that in just a moment. Tomatoes. Tomatoes did not exist in Europe until European colonization, until European exploration of North America, of Central America, of South America. What did a pizza look like? Up until the contact between these two cultures, there were no pizza. And actually, I say that sort of facetiously. Pizza, as we sort of know it, didn't really exist until the late 19th century. Although pizza, which I believe the word comes from Greece, means flatbread, had been something that was in existence for thousands of years. So different forms of pizza had been in existence for a long time. Sort of modern pizza did not exist until the late 19th century. This is an aside, I suppose, because it's about lunchtime and I'm getting a little bit hungry. A piece of pizza might sound good about now. But pizza became popular in the United States in probably about the 1950s or so. Pizza, another interesting fact, is the #1 fast food in the entire world. Anyway, so we have tomatoes, we have tobacco, and as I mentioned earlier, the potato, which was very important, an agricultural, a staple agricultural product of the Incan Empire, of the Incan people. How important was it? Well, not only did the potato support the Incan people and the 1,000 different varieties that the Incas produced, but when the potato was exported to Europe, the potato played a very important role in Irish history. So just to sort of back up for a moment, I think we need to become familiar with the term monoculture. Monoculture is a planting of all of one species or all of one variety. Now, modern guidelines for arboriculture are no more than 30% family, 20% genus, and 10% species. A monoculture planting is when you plant all of one thing. And history has repeated itself over and over again, the consequences of a monocultural planting. And we had this just in the last 15 years, let's say, with emerald ash borer and ash trees that were planted all over the United States. In the 19th century in Ireland, they relied very heavily on the potato, and it got something called, a very generic term, called the potato blight, or a potato blight, blight being a very generic term for a very debilitating and necrotic disease. And because the potato was easy to grow, it did well in the soils in Ireland. The Irish relied very heavily on the potato, and when it all died, or when many of its agricultural production died, the Irish began to starve in the first third of the 19th century. This then began or facilitated some of the first waves of immigration from Ireland to the United States in the middle part of the 19th century. So the potato has I guess we can say, a rich history, a complicated history, and also a tragic history. Again, these are the consequences, the cause and effect of with the European collision of the first peoples of the Western Hemisphere. So old world foods and animals: chickens, cattle, horses, the donkey, wheat, barley, oats, rye, peaches, pears, and sugar. Lots of interesting things about each of these different elements. As I said, in the Incan Empire, one of the most amazing things, I think, is that they had no real beasts of burden, just the cameloids, the alpaca and the llama. So no horses, no donkey. As I said earlier, the American horse died out, and sort of an anecdotal story. In the 1540s, when Coronado, Spanish explorer, took horses with him and brought horses up in the early part, mid part of the 16th century, brought horses with him from Mexico into North America. Some of these horses escaped and sort of anecdotally then sort of repopulated or began again a new population of horses. As I said, the native horse died out in the late Pleistocene. And so some of those horses were called mustangs, which come from the Spanish word musteño, which means an escaped livestock, or in this case, an escaped horse. And obviously the Mustang is the name of a very popular sports car, a very popular car by Ford. This is the sort of animal that won't be tied down, if you will. So this is a sort of an anecdotal story of how horses repopulated North America. And then sugar. And sugar plays a very important role. I said earlier that in the 3 Gs, gold, glory, and guns, maybe not so much gold, but very shortly after, gold or wealth was able to be attained through sugar production. And we might be familiar with slavery in the 18th and 19th century in America, tobacco, rice, and king cotton. In the very southern part of the United States, there was sugar production. But sugar was the primary agricultural product of the Caribbean. And sugar production was particularly harsh. Unlike, let's say, for instance, slaves in North America, that in many cases, more often than not, slaves were able to live into old age, have children, and that sort of thing. Slavery in, we're going to talk about slavery, but slavery in the Caribbean and in the northern part of South America was particularly brutal. The conditions for growing sugar make it particularly brutal. The production of sugar, a particularly brutal process. And slaves more often than not died, and this facilitated bringing more and more slaves to the Caribbean, to Mexico, and to South America. Okay, the environment and culture in Europe. So why leave? We talked about some of this, 15th to the 17th centuries. There were crowded cities. There was famine. There was no space. And I think this is interesting. When we think today in the 21st century, when we think of Europe, or we think of, when we think of Europe, hundreds of years ago, or even North America hundreds of years ago, we get this sense that, they're not as technologically savvy and there weren't as many people. Europe in the 16th century was a pretty crowded place. People wanted to escape. There was a movement from the rural to the urban centers. In urban centers, and as we see, case in point today, some of the hot spots for the spread of disease is where there are large congregations of people. In the 16th century and the 15th century, in these large urban centers, there was uncleanliness, there was plagues. In the 14th century, the bubonic plague swept through Europe, killing maybe 50% of the population before it subsided. There was war. And this, again, facilitated the age of exploration, conquering, imperialism, colonialization. Paris in the 17th century, 500,000 people. And here's just an image from the 18th century, the Spanish Steps in Barcelona, a beautiful place to visit. I had an opportunity to do some traveling, BC, before children. Did a lot of things, BC, before children. And what did Europeans see when they came to the New World? They saw resources. They saw beauty. They saw the Caribbean Sea. I mean, aren't these things that in our culture today we romanticize? Isn't there a franchise of movies that romanticizes this period of time, the Pirates of the Caribbean, right? And in the old days when people used to cruise, people would come up from all over the world to cruise the Caribbean. San Salvador Island, Christ the Savior, Christopher Columbus encountered, and scholars think this is where he first landed in the Caribbean, the native Lucayans, which means sweet and gentle. So what are the sorts of sights that Europeans saw? Well, first of all, southeastern United States. I mean, marshes and wildflowers and grasslands and forests. In Mexico, I mean, these are picturesque. And yet, at the same time, I mean, there is a thriving culture here. In the capital of the Aztec Empire, Tenochtitlan, which is now Mexico City, there were 400,000 people living there at the time of European contact. But, you know, Europeans came here and they saw these resources, and they saw how land was not being used in the way that Europeans could have used it, or an absence of what they considered technology. In the Andes, in Peru, in Ecuador, the Incan Empire. Beautiful landscape. And these landscapes, some, you know, that we can see just a glimpse of in some of these images, the relationship between the landscape, the land, the natural world, and theology, that the basis of theological systems, of religion, philosophy, is often tied to the landscape, to the beauty, to aesthetics, to function. Well, these are things that the Europeans were not really all that interested in, because these were things that were not being utilized on their behalf. Central America, the Mayan Empire. The Mayan Empire is also another empire which is really just, I mean, all three of them are really just quite remarkable. The Mayan Empire existing in the lowlands of the southern part of Mexico, just mosquitoes and humidity and all sorts of different things, and yet a culture that was thriving before European contact. So here is a map of North America and Mexico and South America. And the key that is in the lower left-hand corner, which you can't see because I'm standing in front of, the key that is in the lower left-hand corner, I'm staring at a computer right there, I'm not just losing my train of thought quite yet. The key here shows British colonies, Dutch colonies, French colonies, the Portuguese, the Spanish and the Portuguese sort of carved up South America. The Spanish took over much of Mexico. The British in North America. And the history of the Caribbean is a very complicated one. At various times, islands belonged to different countries. And through war or whatnot, the ownership of these Caribbean islands often changed hands. Okay, so we're in the 16th century. We have European contact. We have 50%, perhaps as much, 50% or more of all the first peoples in North America, in the Caribbean, and South America. They have all died because of disease. We have the development of sugar plantations. We have the development of mercantilism, which is different than capitalism. Mercantilism is a form of economic trade, let's say, that a native country imposes or can impose on a colonial possession, where the colonial possession will produce raw goods that then they ship back to their native, the native holding country, and the colonial possession is limited in the purchase of refined goods from the native country. The native country produces goods out of those raw materials, and the idea of this was to increase the wealth of the native country. This created a lot of turmoil. It was, these are sort of broad generalizations, but difficult at times to get resources for people to live in the Caribbean and in other places without having resources and goods. Okay. So we have the development of sugar plantations all throughout the Caribbean. And if you have an opportunity and were allowed to travel one day or even go on a cruise ship, there are all sorts of sugar plantations that you can go visit, whether it's in Puerto Rico, there are a few, in Jamaica, in Grenada, really all throughout the Caribbean, St. Kitts, all sorts of different places where you can visit sugar plantations that are either still even in production. I've visited a couple, or ruins of them. So the history of the Caribbean in the 16th and 17th century is really the history of sugar production. So you had 50% or more of First Peoples that have died. Who was going to farm for sugar? Oftentimes, the owners of sugar plantations were not present. Unlike, let's say, slavery in 18th and 19th century America, where slave masters lived on the plantation, oftentimes in the Caribbean, the owners of the plantation were an absentee. High humidity, high heat, they were not interested in living there. And so they didn't have sort of one-on-one interactions with the people that were on their plantations. Again, as I mentioned earlier, sugar production is a particularly harsh production, and slaves died all the time, and this facilitated bringing more slaves from Africa. So sugar was in very high demand. And there was, in the early beginnings of sugar production, again with this idea of mercantilism, native countries taking raw sugar from the Caribbean, refining it, let's say in France or in Britain, and then selling it on, into the market. That began to change, and you had colonial possessions beginning to sell sugar sort of on the side in order to produce some wealth and in order to obtain goods and other things. So who was going to farm? Who was going to work on these sugar plantations? This facilitated what's called the Middle Passage, the slave trade in the 16th and 17th century. Okay, so what was this? This was Spanish, this was the French, this was the English. Let's see if I have a slide here. Well, let's talk about the Middle Passage. The largest movement of people in history. The middle part of the Middle Passage, and I think I do have a slide here, the middle part of this is the voyage from the African coast across the Atlantic to the Caribbean, to South America, to North America. So the first part of the journey, Europeans brought goods to the West African slave coast to trade for slaves. So let's say in Spain or in England, they would sail south. Let's see if we have, yeah, okay, so this will help us, and I'll flip back. So in Britain or in Spain or in France, they would sail south to the African coast. Maybe they stop in the Canary Islands. They would get water and some supplies, food and whatnot, do some repairs, and then they would make their way to the African coast. Slavery had existed in Africa well before Europeans came to the African continent to buy slaves. The understanding of slaves, and we don't have time to go into this right now, the understanding of slavery was a little bit different, let's say, in North America or in the Western Hemisphere than it did in Africa. Again, broad generalization, but slavery in Africa was not really chattel slavery. I mean, you were a possession. Oftentimes, you became a slave as part of the spoils of war. It was not generational. It wasn't your sons and everybody that came after you was not a slave. That certainly was very different in North America. Slavery existed where through war, where Africans would go into the interior of Africa, capture slaves, bring them to the coast for sale to European powers. Okay, so this was an important source of revenue for various communities and cultures in Africa. And let me also just qualify this. I've said this in earlier lectures and in different world literature lectures and American literature. When we talk about Africa, we can see a portion of Africa. And I would suggest to you to look at a map of Africa. It is a large continent. And oftentimes when we say that slaves were taken from Africa, we think that like Native Americans or Africans or other countries in the world, that everybody was the same. People in Africa are all the same. So if somebody was captured in the northern part of Africa and we're in a ship with somebody from the interior of Africa or the southern part of Africa, they can sort of chat things over on the way to the Caribbean. That was not the case. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of different languages in Africa, thousands of different cultures, thousands of different belief systems. So more often than not, people traveling together, people captured and put on ships, were unable to communicate together. Can you imagine the kind of fear that one would have without knowing where you're going and without being able to talk and ask questions and get some sort of comfort? So I think that is an important point I want to bring to our attention. Weeks to months long voyage to the Americas. European ships were then brought back to Europe. So again, the first stage of this Middle Passage, you had European powers go south, they go to Africa, they sell goods in exchange for slaves. They made the trip across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. They dropped off, they sold their slaves, and then went back to Europe. Okay, three-part passage. The Middle Passage is the journey from Africa to the Americas. So Africans, again, different cultures, languages. This was very isolating. Deplorable conditions. There were two sort of bodies of thought pertaining to how to transport slaves. And this was a bit of experimentation. Maybe put enough slaves with enough space to ensure that the majority of the slaves that you took across the ocean would survive. That, however, gave way to let's pack the ship as full as possible. Even if 20 or 30% or more of your slave cargo died, you'd have enough slaves to make it a profitable journey. According to Oluda Equiano, who was a slave in the 18th century, captured from what is now Nigeria, and he ended up becoming a shipmate, a slave to a sailor, a master of Great Britain. According to, and he wrote in his journals, according to Oluda Equiano, quote, again I'm reading from a computer, I don't think that you can see that, but I'm not staring off into space. The closeness, quote, the closeness of the place and the heat of the climate added to the number in the ship, which was so crowded that each had scarcely room to turn himself, almost suffocated us. This produced copious perspirations, so that the air soon became unfit for respiration from a variety of loathsome smells, and brought on a sickness among the slaves, of which many died. Three-part journey, the Middle Passage. Hard to determine how many slaves, how many survived. At the time when I put this presentation together some years ago, 10 to 15 million were shipped between 1500 and 1900. Just recently, I read maybe as 24 to 30 million people were captured and sold as slaves. So this is not, scholars have some different methodology, different ways of compiling the data here. So I've read some different numbers. Some put 20% of the human cargo died on the Middle Passage. I've seen statistics that suggest even more. The Caribbean and South America on sugar plantations, again, were particularly harsh, and this facilitated the continuation of the slave society, of the slave business, of bringing more and more. At a certain point in North America, a little bit later on, North American slave populations in the 18th and 19th century became, and this sort of corresponded in the early 19th century with prohibitions against bringing new slaves to North America, but slave populations became sustainable. Slaves had families. The children of slaves were also slaves, and that sort of thing. In the Caribbean, slaves lived for a number of years. They died. You got more. Plantation economy. Large number of native and imported slaves. African climates were similar to the Caribbean. I mentioned this earlier, often an absent slave master. So this, there wouldn't be any sort of interaction between the owner of a plantation and his slaves. Caribbean slaves were cheap, and this is another area of interest. In 1650, about 7 pounds, which was the equivalent of 1 horse or 1 cow. So I suppose if you were a slave owner on a plantation in the Caribbean and you had to decide, and you only had 6 or 7 pounds, and this is something that economists often try to calculate with varying degrees, often on a broad spectrum. How much does something cost in the 17th century? How much does something cost in the 19th century? There are a variety of ingredients to those sorts of equations, cost of living and things like that, the value of money at the time, and all sorts of different things. But if you were making a decision, do you want a horse? Do you want a cow? Do you want to buy a slave? In the early part of the 19th century, for instance, a slave in North America, a house slave might cost as much as $2,000. And economists have looked at $2,000, and a house slave was maybe the highest, on the highest branch of the hierarchy for slaves in North America. But a house slave costing $2,000 might have been the equivalent of, I've seen actuarial data that suggests $2,000 could be $20,000, it could be $100,000. Very difficult to sort of understand and contextualize the purchase of goods hundreds of years ago and what they're worth today. So sugar production, particularly harsh, and here I have an image of some sugar production in the early 20th century. So settled the New World between 1500 and 1800, slavery. Arguably one of the most profitable businesses in Europe. American ship owners, farmers, and fishermen in North America played an important role. Slavery in South America, and particularly slavery in the Caribbean, was important to early American colonialists. The Puritans, their first ship that they produced in North America was used to fish for cod, which was dried out and sent and sold for slaves in the Caribbean. So North America plays a role in the history of slavery in the Caribbean as well. Slave plantations of the West Indies became the largest market for American fish, oats, corn, flour, lumber, peas, beans, hogs, and horses. And these were a part of large exports to Europe, all based upon slave labor. Okay, so this is the end of part 2, but we are going to continue on. I have a few more slides. This is the history, just to sort of recap where we are and where we have been. We're going to be talking about Aphra Behn's novel Oroonoko, which was published in the later part of the 17th century, about 1688 or so. In order to understand the historical context in 1688, we needed to go back a little bit further in time to understand European contact, of how we get to the Europeans being in the Americas and where we get to history in the later part of the 17th century. Why that is also important is because Aphra Behn's novel is about a colony on the northeastern part of South America in Suriname, at least the second half of the novel. So both in terms of the historical context, in terms of the production of the novel Oroonoko, the moment in history that Aphra Behn was writing Oroonoko, and the time period with which Aphra Behn is writing about, all of these things sort of intersect, and why I wanted to talk a little bit more about the history prior to the later part of the 17th century. So, let's get to Aphra Behn, the novel, and Oroonoko. Who was Aphra Behn? And what is this business about the first novel, and what is Oroonoko all about? Well, I don't know what Oroonoko is all about. That's what your job is. I have an idea about what Oroonoko is about, but you have to read it and come up with your own ideas. Aphra Behn was a playwright, a poet, a translator, and a fiction writer. These things are important. What's also important, we have an image here of Aphra Behn, is Aphra Behn was a woman. Parts of Aphra Behn's early life were unclear, although there's some evidence to suggest that Aphra Behn was a spy for Charles II and spent some time in Suriname. That Oroonoko is not just completely fictional, but there are some aspects of it that are historical. So she spent some time in Suriname, and Oroonoko was published in 1688. The genre is considered early, maybe the early modern period. So what's going on in 1688? Well, just to sort of contextualize in terms of literature, at the beginning of the 17th century, you still have Shakespeare performing plays. The later part of the 17th century, we have maybe a new form. Okay? Is Oroonoko a novel? And this is, I think it's interesting and important for us to have some understanding of what literary scholarship does in thinking about not only the content of a particular story, not only the historical context, but also its form. Up until maybe the 17th century, the literary form was dominated by something else. Epic poetry, and I have some examples of some other sorts of poetry here. So what's going on in the 17th century? Popularity of novels, with maybe beginning with Oroonoko, the rise of literacy, the rise of a middle class, so people have money to, a little bit of extra spending money to buy things like books and pamphlets. Stories are not about heroes, but about regular people. Now, I guess there's an argument that Oroonoko is not a regular person, but Oroonoko is not Odysseus. Oroonoko is not Gilgamesh. I think at times he is a kind of mythic figure, but there's also some regular people doing regular things, including Oroonoko. Is the novel a woman's genre? Well, up until this time, you know, we're writing, men, serious writers are writing, you know, they're writing some lyrical poetry. They're the cavalier poets and things like that. But they're writing epic narrative poems, right? I mean, John Milton's Paradise Lost. I mean, this is a serious, epic narrative poem. I'm sorry, you wanted to do what? You wanted to write a novel? Like fiction? Yeah, I suppose you can do that. No one's really going to take you seriously. Except a lot of people, except us, whom are reading this book today. Some scholars widely consider Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, 1791, the first novel. Some scholars suggest that Sir Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur in the later part of the 15th century is the first novel. I think Oroonoko, however, has all of the ingredients of being at least one of the first novels, if not the first novel. So what does it mean to be a novel? Well, unfortunately today, in our current world historical moment, we're using the word novel to describe a disease. Novel means new. So what is going to become the dominant literary form called novel was a new form in the 17th century. The novel is written in prose. The story finds one protagonist or group of characters from beginning to end. There are certain aspects of realism. Certain aspects. Now, realism is a literary genre in the later part of the 19th century. I don't want to confuse the literary genre, literary philosophical, musical genre, if you will, artistic genre, in the later part of the 19th century with my comment that there are aspects of realism in the novel. There are things that we can read and we say, yeah, okay, that's something that I can experience or I have experienced or makes sense to me in relation to the world that I live in the everyday. And there are other literary forms. There are journals, there's poetry, there's travelogues. As I said, at the beginning of the 17th century, Shakespeare is still performing plays. And to give you another example, a poem that I think that you have heard of, Robert Herrick's To the Virgins, to make much use of time. Gather ye rosebuds while ye may, oh time is still a-flying. And this same flower that smiles today, tomorrow will be a-dying. This is a poem that we've heard before. This is what men are producing. Again, the novel, a long piece of prose. This is new. You want to write that, Aphra, Behn? Knock yourself out. Go ahead. We'll see where it gets you. I think it's gotten her a lot. I think it's gotten us a lot. So a little bit about Aphra Behn, a little bit about thinking about what it means, what a novel means. And now just a couple of slides and sort of our pre-thinking or some ideas about Oroonoko as a text for us to consider before you read the text. The novel, I think, is divided into two parts. The first part of the action of the novel, the plot of the novel, takes place in Africa. The second part takes place in Suriname, and something significant is going to happen to get us from Africa to Suriname, and that is the enslavement of Oroonoko, once king, now slave. So things for us to consider. In the first part, the love of Oroonoko and Imawinda. This has a kind of fairy tale quality. I would identify it, and I think other scholars have as well, identify the first part of Oroonoko as a romance, as very courtly in many ways. It reminds me of the lays even of Marie de France. The second part of the novel gets pretty real, pretty quick. This is an ethnography of colonial life. In this, I think the text relies very heavily on Aphra Behn, the real person, as spending some time in Suriname. There are aspects of her observations which Europeans, we would never be privy to, that we learn about culture through Aphra Behn's prose. So the second part of the novel, we see aspects of colonial life, very violent moments, anthropological moments where natives' cultures and environments, again, that we learn about. And we learn, there becomes a kind of argument about slavery. And Aphra Behn, the audience, the readership of this text, she has to be very conscientious of. The institution of slavery is firmly embedded in European culture, and in many ways this becomes a critique of that culture, but she has to sort of thread the needle, if you will, very carefully, both in terms of critiquing society and slavery, and because she is a woman who is doing so. So again, things for us to consider before reading the text. The love story between Oroonoko and Imawinda, as I mentioned a moment ago, is, I think, a beautiful love story. It's romantic. But I also want us to consider the love between Anahal and Aboan. Physical descriptions, beauty as it relates to age, and perceptions of value. What I think is really interesting to me about this novel and about literature in general, and maybe if we were to sort of expand that conversation and to think about what makes a literary text great, is because the sorts, the sorts of themes that are trying to be fleshed out, or the sorts of interpretations that we can make about a text, are not relegated to the 17th century or the 16th century or the 18th century, but are relevant today. So I want us to pay attention to perceptions of beauty as it relates to value. In the text, I want us to pay attention to allusions, comparisons to the European culture, moments of violence and its subsequent effects of trauma. What does it mean to experience the traumatic moment? What does it mean to, or I should say, let me qualify that. What does it mean to experience the traumatic moment firsthand? What does it mean for us to see, or another character to see, the violent moment? That becomes a kind of trauma as well. I want us to pay attention to the cultural similarities and differences between free people and slaves, between Africans, colonialists, and Europeans. Particularly in the second half of the novel, the various representations, justifications, or perceptions of slavery. What are the subtle, inconspicuous arguments that Aphra Behn is making about slavery? And it wasn't just a social critique that Aphra Behn was making about slavery. Thinkers from all over Europe were thinking about slavery and what does it mean to a culture, to a nation, to the slaves themselves. So the sorts of critique that we may see in Behn's Oroonoko highlight, parallel, mirror the sorts of discussions in intellectual and cultural circles that were going on in Europe at the time. Obviously, those discussions did not win out on eradicating slavery. What role does the narrator play? What role does the author's gender play in the construction of this text and the kinds of social critiques that the narrator and the author might be making? Okay. Thank you very much.